Welcome to Therapy Inspired. As therapists, we have a unique view of the world. We hold space for grief and trauma, yet we also witness resilience and healing, all while being humans ourselves. We hope to share helpful psychoeducational insights from our world as psychotherapists in and out of the therapy room. And while we'll be talking about things therapy related, listening and engaging in this podcast doesn't equate a client therapist relationship. And though we might be using insights from our work with various clinical issues, we don't reference specific cases. Hi, I'm Kameela Osman. I'm a registered social worker. I have a clinic, Elite Counseling and Consulting in Bowmanville, where I do in-person and virtual therapy throughout Ontario.
Hi, I'm Darby Crosby. I work at Crosby Counseling and Wellness, where I see clients virtually throughout Ontario. I see individuals, couples, families, and Camilla and I both do supervision of students as well.
So last session, we were talking about self-talk, and today we're going to go a little bit deeper into self-criticism. Why are we self-critical and why are we judgmental? There are some reasons why that part of our mind comes up. Criticism sounds like a negative thing, but to be critical actually is an important skill for us to have. To be critical refers to being discerning. To have judgment is different than being judgmental, where we're passing judgment frequently, but to, again, be discerning of what's a situation that will keep me safe? What's a friend that's a good friend versus a friend that isn't helpful to us, that might be someone that we can't trust. And so the other thing with self-criticism and judgment is it can help us keep on track with our goals. Are we acting in line with our goals, or are we detracting from that? And then criticism can also help us, not necessarily criticism helping us support growth, but it can help us direct ourselves into what are areas that I do want to grow, being critical in that way without necessarily going overboard. And that overboard part is what we'll be exploring a bit deeper today, how to keep that being critical from being overly critical, where we're dismissing positives and we're not accepting ourselves and what's going on in our world for what it is. And we're just stuck in the judgment of it, thinking that something is wrong with what's going on in our world. And that's part of the self-talk that's happening in our mind.
Yeah, and as we talked about last time, self-criticism and judgment, self-talk, all that stuff can be more habitual. Narratives that have been brought down through the generations in terms of our family or our culture, whatever. It can be, sort of a limiting belief, like we said before, I can't do math because somebody at one point said that, I wasn't good at math. So again, what we want to do is to be able to identify those things, understand where they came from, and then rewrite them to be more helpful, like Camilla just said, to promote our growth. Are there any gaps that I need to sort of improve on or expand upon? Like often people who are overachievers are very competitive athletes often will resist being gentler with themselves because they feel that they have to be really hard on themselves in order to sort of push beyond that point. And it's not always the case, right? Sometimes we just have to be able to sort of accept where we're at and say, next time we'll do better. It'll work out.
Yeah. Yeah. I often use the example of if we trip while we're running a race, which goes along with the idea of athletes. If we stop and criticize ourselves, what's wrong with us, if we're harsh with ourselves, shaming ourselves for falling, that stopped us from continuing to run that race. Whereas if we're self-compassionate, if we can be gentle with ourselves, I fell, I'm going to get up and keep going, that's actually more effective and will help us meet our goals faster. And so that shift to being self-compassionate is really important. That shift to watching, where does the criticism go from helping us, know what we want and to promote growth to actually being a deterrent from growth. And I see this also in child psychology. So I do a lot of work with parents from a perinatal lens, and from a parenting perspective, from a child psychology perspective, we know, and a lot of people accept, that positive reinforcement is much more effective than negative reinforcement. If we tell a child, what's wrong with you? Why can't you tie your shoes? We know, I think most of us would agree, that's not a way to motivate a child. It actually creates some anxiety and can delay some of those developmental milestones if we're using that negative reinforcement. We know that that positive reinforcement, you're doing so good. I believe in you. You can do it. We understand that when it comes to children. And yet many of us as adults, the same adults that are doing gentle parenting with our children, forget to be gentle with ourselves. We're using that harsh language, again, because some of it may come from narratives. It's been how we've always talked to ourselves. It's hard for us to change that within ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's where, as we talked about before, affirmations or alternative thoughts can be really helpful in shifting the patterns from that sort of judgmental, negative, sort of critical voice to something that's a little bit more encouraging and helpful. So we want to sort of encourage ourselves to be able to do better the next time, to overcome any hurdles as we go through life. We don't want to have those automatic negative sort of statements coming up all the time that, as Kameela just mentioned, may hinder our growth or moving forward, right? If I keep saying to myself, oh, you're so stupid, you keep getting everything wrong, then I'm not going to take those chances. I'm not going to try to move forward. Whereas if I sort of reframe it and say, well, I'm human, I make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. Or maybe I've learned that if I rush through something that, again, that's why I made mistakes, because I wasn't being as careful. And so I have to be gentle with myself to allow myself the time to do the things that I need to do. And I think especially in parenting, I think it's really easy to be self-critical. Like, did I do the right thing? Was I too harsh? Oh, should I have let them get away with that? Like we question a lot of things because there's so many social pressures as parents.
Yeah, I love that example, Darby. The one thing that's coming to my mind is Dr. Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion. One of the things she talks about as a component of self-compassion is common humanity. And so recognizing we all deserve that grace. I'm not alone in these feelings of making mistakes. I'm not alone in these feelings of sometimes slipping into overly self-criticism or self-judgment. And so to remember that we aren't alone in our feelings gives that validation and brings a lot of that self-compassion. And I often see self-compassion as the antidote for self-criticism, to remember that we are deserving of that same grace, that same kindness, empathy, understanding that we give to other people. And that's what compassion in itself involves. It's giving that grace, kindness, and understanding to others. And often people that I come across who struggle with self-criticism for themselves are very compassionate for others. There's a disconnect and a contradiction there where they're not, and we will talk about perfectionism in the next episode, but they're not holding others to that same standard. They're holding themselves, they're judging themselves and speaking to themselves from a self-talk lens in ways that they wouldn't speak to anyone else. And that voice, people from the outside may never think that they're speaking like that to themselves inside. So you want to watch for if you're using language in your own mind towards yourself that you wouldn't be using with anyone out loud. That's a bit of a flag that you're being really harsh with yourself. The other thing is to, coming back to the example that we talked about with the running the race, is to look for when we're thinking of ambition as the same as self-criticism. To have ambition doesn't necessarily mean we need to be harsh or critical on ourselves. It doesn't mean we need to judge. We can have ambition without shame. And just like in my example, when we have ambition without shame, it frees us. When we have ambition, I want to be able to be able to run this race. Sorry, I've got the race on my mind. I want to be able to run this race. I want to accomplish this goal. And we aren't stuck in the shame of it. We can get past our missteps. We can get off track and gently get ourselves back on track. When we're stuck in that ambition with shame and the self-criticism, the judgment, what I find is the second we fall off track, our mind says, I've messed up. What's wrong with me again? And I don't know, I can't do this. We get stuck in the negative loop of I don't know how to overcome this, rather than actually taking that same energy and putting it behind, I've got to keep going. I've just got to get back on track. Making a mistake or falling off track with our ambitions doesn't suddenly mean that we're back at square one. It means that we've taken some step back, and sometimes we can learn from those missteps and step back. We can take that information and say, okay, this is why I fell off track. This is what can keep me on track next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of comes into the play when we hear shoulds or must, like I should do this or I must do this. Like those kinds of statements should alert us to the fact that we're being judgmental. We're taking on what somebody else has told us that we should or must do. So when we hear those statements to ourselves, or if somebody says that to us, we really want to sort of go back and see whether or not there's any sort of validity to this. Is this a narrative from before? Is this something that I thought I had to do as a parent, as a person, as a worker? Or is this something that I really need to sort of look at and reassess and try to reshape things and give myself the encouragement to grow and to move forward?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important when you hear shoulds or musts in your
Mhm.
head to sort of really be aware that those might not be things that you want to do. It may be things that, have been imposed through society or whatever. So again, be gentle with yourself when you hear that.
Yeah. What I also think of with that is that sometimes when we identify where that may have come from, it may not be one root, it may be multiple roots, as you're saying, society or intergenerational pieces, cultural beliefs. But when we do identify some of those roots, we can also identify like where that was that skewed thinking to start with. And that can sometimes lead to a sense of like freeing us from that narrative. If we recognize the thoughts were skewed to begin with, that means that they're skewed right now and that it's not actually serving us. And the reframe becomes almost more powerful. Our emotional self can then connect with that reframe
Mhm.
next week. And I think the shoulds and must is a great place to wrap up today because next week we'll be diving more into perfectionism. And it's kind of like self-criticism on overdrive, the shoulds and must, those beliefs that and narratives we can hold onto with rigidity are a big part of what can propel some of those perfectionist traits. So thank you for listening, and we can't wait for you to join us next week. Not sorry, not next week, next episode.